My brother held my inhaler inches from my face while I clawed at the air, vision tunneling, chest collapsing like someone had cinched it with wire. He tilted his head, smirked, and whispered, "Gasp, loser." I was 8 years old the first time he did it. But today he couldn't even look at me without trembling. Because the courtroom doors were about to open, and for the first time in his life, I wasn't the one struggling to breathe. My name is Elena Ward. I'm 32, a respiratory therapist, and currently single and rebuilding my life in ways I used to think were impossible. If you're here because you've ever been dismissed, minimized, or told your pain was an exaggeration, this story is for you. Growing up, I thought every family had a villain hiding in plain sight. Mine just happened to be my older brother, Chase. 2 years ahead in school, 5 inches taller, and somehow 10 times meaner. He wasn't the cartoon bully type. No, his cruelty was calculated, quiet, precise, designed to look like siblings being siblings to anyone who didn't look too closely. My asthma attacks were the perfect target. He knew exactly how long he could hold my inhaler out of reach before panic set in. He studied my wheezing like a mechanic inspecting a failing engine, waiting, listening, timing it. And the moment my knees buckled or my eyes filled with tears, that's when he'd toss the inhaler at me with a bored flick of his wrist and say, "Drama queen." I'd run to our mother, gasping, shaking, trying to explain what he did, but she always waved a hand like she was shooing away a fly. "Elena, stop tattling. You're too sensitive. Chase is just teasing." Sensitive, dramatic, overreacting. Those words shaped my childhood far more than the choking episodes did. I learned to survive in the small gaps between danger and denial, to predict the cadence of an approaching attack, to hide inhalers around the house like contraband, to stay quiet when Chase walked into the room because silence was safer than breathing wrong. But the thing about childhood trauma is that it doesn't stay in childhood. It sinks into the bones, whispers through the bloodstream, reshapes the lungs. You grow up, but your body remembers. Every shallow breath, every stolen one. And Chase? He grew up too, into someone who never learned consequences, never learned limits, and certainly never learned empathy. What started as inhaler games became manipulation. What became manipulation turned into something far darker. But before we get there, before we step fully into the courtroom where everything finally cracked open, you need to understand the moment my childhood ended and the fear that followed me for decades. A fear I finally learned to stop inhaling. Most people expect childhood bullies to mellow with age, to grow out of cruelty like it's a phase, like baby teeth that eventually fall out. Chase didn't. He sharpened, he refined. He learned that physical control leaves marks people can see, but emotional leverage, that could run silently for years. By the time I was in college, the jokes had evolved into something more insidious. Chase discovered the power of downplaying my reality. If I had a flare-up, he'd crack a joke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Elena's lungs are just lazy. She's allergic to responsibility." People laughed. They always laughed. And every laugh carved a new story into me. Not sick, not struggling, dramatic. That word followed me like a shadow. I didn't realize the damage until years later, working as a respiratory therapist, when a patient's panic attack triggered my own in a flash of memory. Chase dangling my rescue, my life between two careless fingers. My body had learned to correlate breathlessness with shame. Still, I tried to forgive him. I tried to believe we'd outgrown the old dynamic. I even agreed, stupidly, to let him stay with me temporarily while he looked for an apartment after a breakup. I thought boundaries and adulthood would change the rules. Instead, he walked through my front door like he owned the deed. It started small, comments, dismissals, reminders that he didn't respect me. Then one night, after I asked him to clean up after himself, he laughed in my face. "Relax, Lena. You act like missing a chore is gonna make you stop breathing." My chest tightened, not from illness, from memory. And then came the moment that changed everything. Late September, cold air drifting in through the cracked kitchen window. I was reorganizing the cabinet where I keep my emergency meds, habit, muscle memory, when I realized one inhaler was missing, then another, 3 gone. I felt it instantly, the old childhood panic rising like a ghost I never invited back. I found Chase in the living room, stretched on the couch, scrolling his phone. "Have you seen my inhalers?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Yeah, I moved them." My stomach dropped. "Where?" Finally, he lifted his eyes, slow and mocking. "Somewhere safe. You leave them everywhere. Thought I'd help." "Chase, give them back." He smirked. The same smirk. The same one from 20 years ago. "God, you still freak out like you're 8. They're just inhalers." "Where are they?" I could hear the tight rasp in my own voice. My airways respond to stress before I consciously do. Fight or flight built directly into my lungs. He sat up then, expression shifting into something colder. "You know what your problem is? You never learned to take a joke, and now you're acting like I'm abusing you." That word, abusing, hung in the air like a dare. I backed away, breath thin, chest stiffening. This wasn't playful. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was the same game he played as a boy, repackaged for adulthood. Withholding something vital, watching me panic, feeding on control. I managed to get to the bedroom, where I kept one last inhaler tucked deep in a drawer. My hands trembled as I used it, shame burning hotter than the constriction in my lungs. Something inside me snapped cleanly in two. This wasn't sibling teasing, this wasn't immaturity, it was a pattern, consistent, escalating, intentional. I slept with the door locked that night. The next morning, Chase discovered the lock and pounded on the door so hard the hinges rattled. "Really? You locking me out now?" When I didn't answer, he kicked the lower panel and shouted, "You think this is abuse? You haven't even seen what real abuse looks like." That was the moment I finally believed myself. Believed the child I had been. Believed every wheeze, every denial, every dismissed cry for help. I called a friend, then a lawyer, and eventually the police. Because an adult withholding medical devices is not a joke. And this time, I had documented everything. 3 months later, Chase would be sitting on a wooden bench outside a courtroom, hands shaking, leg bouncing uncontrollably, refusing to meet my eyes. And for the first time in my life, he couldn't take my breath away. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt colder than winter, too wide, too bright, too still. The kind of place where truth echoes louder than lies. I stepped through security with my folder of documentation tucked under my arm, inhaler clipped discreetly inside my jacket pocket. Not out of fear this time, but out of habit. One I was finally learning didn't make me weak. Chase was already there. He sat on the wooden bench outside courtroom 2B, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles went bone white. For a moment, he didn't even notice me. He was staring at the floor, chest rising too fast. Irony tasted sharp on my tongue. When he finally looked up, our eyes locked, and I watched something flicker in his. Recognition, then fear. Not fear of me, fear of consequences. "Elena," he said quietly, voice cracking in a way I'd never heard. "We don't have to do this. It was all blown out of proportion." There it was again. The family script. Minimize, dismiss, rewrite history until my memories felt like fiction. But the difference now was simple. I no longer needed his validation to believe what happened. So I said nothing. I simply walked past him and sat on the opposite bench. My lawyer, Ms. Grant, arrived seconds later, sleek, calm, and sharp enough to cut through steel. She gave me a reassuring nod before turning her gaze to Chase, who immediately dropped his eyes like a child caught doing something he could no longer explain away. When the clerk opened the doors and called the case, Chase flinched visibly. He had always been the one in control. But courtrooms aren't playgrounds. Judges don't coddle grown men who never learned boundaries. Inside, the air hummed with fluorescent quiet. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and a reputation for zero patience, scanned the papers before her. "Ms. Ward," she said, without looking up, "your statement confirms that your brother knowingly interfered with medically necessary devices on multiple occasions. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." My pulse thrummed, but my voice stayed steady. Strong. I had spent a lifetime losing breath around him. Not today. Chase shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, I didn't mean any harm. She has always exaggerated things. It was never dangerous." The judge's eyes lifted, sharp as a scalpel. "Mr. Ward, withholding prescribed medication from someone with a respiratory condition is inherently dangerous. The intent is irrelevant. The behavior is documented." Chase swallowed hard. His knees started bouncing again, uncontrollably. Ms. Grant stepped forward. "Your Honor, we would also like to enter into record the photographic evidence of removed inhalers, the recorded threats made during the September incident, and the witness statement from Ms. Ward's colleague, who heard the aftermath." The judge nodded. "Admitted." Chase's lawyer, clearly unprepared for the depth of documentation, leaned toward him and whispered something. Whatever it was made Chase pale. I watched him crumble, inch by inch, under the weight of accountability. It was not satisfying in the way revenge fantasies portray. It was quieter, simpler, a truth finally landing where it belonged. The judge tapped her pen against the bench. "Mr. Ward, the court is ordering a restraining order effective immediately. You will cease all contact with your sister for the duration specified. Additionally, mandatory counseling and a behavioral evaluation will be required. Any violation will escalate to criminal charges. Do you understand?" Chase nodded stiffly. "Speak," the judge snapped. "Yes, Your Honor." For a moment, the room felt utterly still, like the world exhaled for me, the breath I had once begged for. As the hearing adjourned, Chase tried to approach me, but the bailiff stepped between us. He stopped then, just a few feet away, shaking his head like he couldn't reconcile this version of reality, one where he wasn't untouchable, one where I wasn't the helpless kid gasping at his feet. "Elena, I never thought you'd actually do this," he said. I met his eyes calmly. "That's the problem, Chase. You never thought I could." And then I walked out of the courtroom with my lungs full, my steps steady, the air finally mine. The air outside the courthouse smelled sharper than I remembered, like cold stone and early winter wind. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the world settle around me, letting the weight of what had just happened sink somewhere deep and final. People talk about closure like it's a door that slams shut, but I think it's quieter, more gradual, the hinge clicking soft and steady until you realize the room behind you has gone silent. For days after the hearing, I found myself reaching for my inhaler more often. Out of habit, not necessity. Trauma does that. Even when the danger is gone, the body still expects the worst. But over time, something surprising happened. The attacks didn't come. The panic didn't spike. The air didn't thin around me. My lungs, it seemed, finally believed what my mind was still learning, that I was safe. My parents didn't call. I wasn't expecting them to. For years, they had minimized Chase's behavior until the story became easier to ignore than confront. Facing what happened in court would mean admitting they overlooked signs that were practically screaming. Silence was their refuge. But silence can be a wound, or it can be a boundary. I chose to see it as the latter. A week later, I spent a quiet evening in my apartment. My apartment, no longer shadowed by someone slamming doors or hiding life-saving medication out of spite. I brewed tea, lit a candle, and sat on the floor with my back against the couch, a blanket draped over my knees. For the first time in years, my breathing felt ordinary, unremarkable, beautifully unremarkable. That night, I opened a journal and wrote 5 words. I am allowed to breathe. It sounds simple, maybe too simple to matter. But when you grow up learning that oxygen is something someone else can take from you on a whim, allowing your self-breath becomes an act of rebellion. I started therapy again, not to relive the past, but to understand it, to unlearn the reflex of shrinking whenever someone raises their voice, to stop apologizing for taking up space. My therapist told me something that changed everything. Your lungs did not fail you, people did. Hearing that felt like stepping into a life where I didn't have to defend my own memories. As for Chase, legally, he vanished from my orbit. The restraining order held firm, and the mandatory counseling meant someone else was finally responsible for assessing the depth of his cruelty. I didn't need updates. I didn't need closure delivered in a neat bow. The courtroom had already given me what I needed: accountability. One evening in early spring, I took a walk around the lake near my apartment. The water shimmered. Kids biked past. Someone's dog chased a stick that landed too far from shore. I inhaled deeply, longer than necessary, because I could, because no one was watching me choke for entertainment, because my breath belonged entirely to me. Healing doesn't hit like a moment of triumph. It unfolds like dawn, slow, quiet, undeniable. I still think about that little girl sometimes, the one on the floor gasping, reaching for a hand that always pulled away. I wish I could tell her that none of it was her fault. I wish I could tell her that one day she'd stand in a courtroom, spine straight, voice steady, and watch the person who terrorized her finally face consequences. I wish I could tell her that she survives, that she grows into someone strong, someone whole, someone capable of helping others reclaim their own breath. And maybe, in telling this story, I just did, because today and every day after, my lungs are my own, my voice is my own, my life is my own, and nothing, least of all him, will ever take the air from me again.